Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 10th of September 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on tonight, and thanks very much for taking some time out of your Tuesday evening to join me in another live chat. Tonight is just me, and so we'll be kicking over some of the issues relating specifically to mortgage stress, what's going on, how's it behaving. And I think the important conversation tonight is that some of the official data that's being produced may not actually be telling the full story. So we're going to try and get below the hood and try and work out what's going on. And no guest tonight, of course. It's just myself. But we'll be able to explore some of the issues. And I'll be able to take some questions, of course, from the audience. Just before I go on, let me just remind you that we're not providing specific financial or legal advice. This is a general conversation only. We do invite you to put your questions and comments into the chat. Please play nice. This is as at the 10th of September if you're watching in replay. If you'd like to ask a specific question, if you use at What the World, that gets it into my special queue so I don't lose it. And I've also enabled Super Chat, which means that if you want to get your question to the top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here, you can do that. It is greatly appreciated. And I must say that we can only continue to make these shows because of the support we get through our various support channels, including Patreon and also via PayPal and other means. So all greatly appreciated. And I can't express enough thanks to those who do support what we do. Now, there are costs involved in doing this. I don't do this for profit. I do this because I think there's a really, really important conversation to be had, specifically around what's happening with households. Anyway, let's get on with the show. And Smooth has just joined. Smooth, you're late. Tut, 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 tut. But I hope you're good anyway. There you go. I'm a bit late. It's only me tonight also. Yeah, yeah, I know. Well, we can have a nice conversation about all things to do with household finances. And I guess a good place to start, let me just put this one up. We're going to look at the latest household data. I did, of course, make a couple of shows earlier on, specifically about some of the background information. Conscious that some people may not have seen that, what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time just recapping some of that. We will then look into some of the more specific information. But before we get into the details of household finances, I felt it was important to contextualize this discussion because there's been a lot of rubbish spoken about what's really going on. And let me just take you through a few new slides and quick slides just to sort of lay the foundation for what we're going to do this evening. And the first point of departure is the most recent data from the ABS that came out today that made the point that the total value of dwelling stock in Australia is up again. So we're still seeing home values bubbling away quite strongly. And interestingly, if you look at the most recent data on new loan commitments, you can see that there's been quite a significant spike up in new lending. Investor lending is actually spiking faster than owner-occupied lending, but it's quite strong. And I guess if I were the RBA, I'd be quite concerned about that growth. This next chart shows you that, in fact, a lot of it is the investor sector, and this data excludes refinancing. What that means is that some people will be, of course, switching from one loan to another. That's excluded from here. This is new lending. So investors are back, baby. And that, of course, is an interesting and concerning suggestion as to what may be happening. Now, if we then look at the data, this is actually from the ABS. And I think Cookie put this one up. And it's shown you that there's been a significant move in loan sizes for owner-occupied dwellings. And nationally, up 8%, in Queensland up 15%, in South Australia up 12%, in Western Australia up 16%, and then Tasmania just 2%, and NT and AC2 too small to notice. Now that's a big deal because what this says is that we've actually got more people getting bigger mortgages at the moment. So one of the questions I get asked quite often is, well, so is the root cause of stress therefore these bigger loans? And what I'll show you later is that, yeah, it's part of the story, but it's certainly not the full story. And one of the things that I want to highlight is how multifaceted this whole question of how households are faring are. the leverage point of view, bigger loans is part of the story, of course. Now, there's another thing to think about too, and that's also the first-time buyers. We are seeing first-time buyers continuing to purchase. And in fact, if you look at the statistics from the ABS, you can see that at around 10,000 new commitments, that's higher than the trend from 2009 to 2020. So whilst it peaked strongly, and that was all to do with government stimulus, home buyers, and pulling value out of ASIC related funds like superannuation, through the let's pull some money out of our super, which ASIC seemed to facilitate quite nicely. It's interesting that we now have the situation where first-time buyers are quite active. And interestingly, the average loan for a first-time buyer is also rising, despite the fact that actually, the borrowing power of first-time buyers is about 40% down from where it was before the recent rises. And there's a very interesting angle here then that says, well, so is it all about interest rates and loans? And the point, I think, is made quite well in this article that, in fact, inflation is smashing incomes more than interest rates are. And I think that's a really important point, and it's certainly that's something that I've been seeing in my analysis and in my surveys, that whilst clearly the steep prices and the steeper loans are part of the story, this higher inflation and indeed higher taxes are what's really eroding household incomes. In fact, as this article says, by triple as much as elevated interest rates. And that undermines the Treasurer's claim that the Reserve Bank of Australia's monetary policy is smashing the economy. No, it's actually inflation which is smashing the economy. And the article broke out some data. This was actually the first part of the story, which showed that the consumer spending power adjusted year on year. And you can see there how inflation and interest payments are actually hitting it. And you can see also that the disposable income is being squeezed down. Now, I come back to disposable income as a really critical point. And in my surveys, of course, and specifically in my detailed analysis, I look at disposable income. So that is income that's available for people to spend after tax. And that's a very important factor because tax has gone up dramatically. And of course, real gross disposable income, so that's what you start with, is also going in a different direction to the one that many people think. So here's data from the OECD and comparing it with Australia that shows that the real gross household disposable income per capita has dropped dramatically. And again, this is part of the pain story. This is why a lot of people are struggling. Disposable income over the last 15 years has been going backwards, and it's dropped specifically strongly in the last 2 or 3 years relative to the OECD. And here's another slide that makes another point, which is really important, that while mortgage interest rates may be taking 5% of household gross income, in fact, income tax is now at a record high of 16.4%. So the tax take is a real part of the stress story. And that's something which I think people need to understand. So when you actually look at what people start with in terms of what they have to spend, they start, of course, with money coming in the door. Then they have to pay the tax man, and that gives them an amount that's left. And then they have to pay for housing and other things. And so it goes on. And what's left is discretionary available spending. So the enhanced tax take that we're seeing, despite, incidentally, the recent tax adjustments that were made as part of the most recent budget, and it came in 1 July, means that pretty much all households are paying more than they've ever done in terms of income tax. And that's not something that Chalmers wants to recognise or refer to, but for me, it's a very important factor in this whole question of why people are where they are. And this other slide, which I'll just quickly share with you, was from IFM, and it showed that if you look at real gross national income and some measuring living standards, which are dropping, you can see there that actually productivity isn't helping, and the terms of trade aren't helping, and in fact, the net foreign income isn't helping. So wherever you look, we have problems. And the final intro is this one. This is actually from Tarek, because, of course, one of the things that happened is we've got a lot of jobs growth but it's in the so-called non-market-based sector of the economy. In other words, it's in sectors that are related to things which are important, but not necessarily in the private sector driving growth. And we've actually propped up the economy by issuing more and more jobs into the public sector. And in fact, this article, Jobs Boom, courtesy of the taxpayer, really makes the point. And another quick intro is, of course, the iron ore prices continuing to slide. You can see where it's headed up. And so when you put all that together, maybe it's not surprising that the household consumer confidence levels fell again, and they're very, very low. And this is something which I think is worth just reflecting on, that in fact households are very much up against it. Now, what we're going to do in a moment or two is then go into more detail, specifically around the analysis. But I thought it was important to contextualize the discussion with the fact that this is not just a housing bubble problem. It is a much bigger, more structural problem, and it's to do with government policy that's been happening over the last 30 or so years. Now, let's have a little look and see what the next part of the show. I'm checking my streaming. Yeah, we're still streaming. That's good. Let me just then show you a couple of other inputs, because there is other data talking about how households are actually going. And the one I mentioned in my show the other day related specifically to the impossible choices. This is actually a New South Wales piece of analysis that showed particularly low-income households are really under the gun. And that's a big deal. And the problem there, of course, is that it means that we know, in line with some of my analysis, that households are up against it. And I have to say that the analysis that they did, it was on a relatively small sample of 1,000, but it was quite interesting, and it did show that the significant pressuring areas were housing, and then food and beverages, and then the question of utilities, medical care and health expenses. And they did specifically point out that people were missing food, missing meals, and also missing out on medical care. So all of those factors, I think, are quite important when trying to understand what precisely is going on. Now, when I actually look at the story here in terms of the question of inflation, of course, the RBA did actually, on this last week, Michelle Bullock made a specific story in the high costs of inflation. And in that specific address, she did talk about the reason why this was an important factor to think about and essentially what was going on. And the bottom line, of course, with all of this is that there are many causes for inflation, but she argued that inflation was the real killer and it needed to be squeezed out. And, she pointed to things like the rent story with the rising rents still going up, maybe not as strongly, but there's a gap between the advertised rents and the CPI rents, of course. And what that means is that in the rental sector, as we'll see, rental stress is pretty significant. Also, it's worth noting that she highlighted that firms were able to still pass on further costs. So the inflation story is not squeezed, definitely not squeezed. There's more to come there. And she also made the point that in the long run, inflation was low for a long period of time. It was high in the 1970s, but it's now a generational high, and people perhaps are unusually concerned about it because they've never experienced it before. But inflation is a real killer, unfortunately, in the long term. And then she went on specifically to talk about household consumption and above the different income quintiles. But I have to highlight, this was from very old data. This is 21-22. We're in 24 now. So this is 2 or 3 years old because they're using some of the data from Hilda, which is way out of date. And she also showed that around 5% of households potentially have a cash flow shortfall. But it's very important that it excluded borrowers in arrears, and it's basically estimates borrowers with a minimum scheduled mortgage payment and essential expenses, proxied by household expenditure measures, but those household expenditure measures are again rather out of date. And the bottom line, she said, some of them will have to sell up. And that's a big deal. So the fact of the matter is that the income pressures and household pressures are very significant. Now, when I come back and then talk about what's going on, it's very important to sort of have that context in mind. And I posed the question, just how many households are in real financial stress? And that's what we're going to touch on today. And, you know, the RBA basically said at 5%, that's 180 to 200,000 households, you know, a relatively small number perhaps in their minds, although I would argue that every one of those households are feeling it. But I don't believe that they're actually accurately stating the story. And if you want another checkpoint on that, there was this piece of data that came out. A staggering 2/3 of Queenslanders are struggling to pay their bills, put food on the table, or send their children to school due to relentless cost of living pressures, with poverty rates expected to skyrocket across the state. That's a new survey from the Queensland Council of Social Services, which found 94% of the state is worried about the cost of living. So these are really significant times and really significant data points. And for me, this is a very important story about what precisely is going on, which sort of takes us quite nicely then to say, well, what does the DFA data actually tell us about all of the things that are happening at the moment, and what's really driving it? Where is the pain? Where is the pressure? And it's important, I think, to contrast this with these sorts of headlines. There's this one that came out: Aussie dream still alive. You can actually buy a home with a 50k deposit. Queenslanders will save 50,000 in savings. Queenslanders with 50,000 in savings can still buy in a range of markets. There's a lot of hopium about. And I think there's a lot of miscommunication about precisely how difficult it is for many households. But of course, pump the markets. And, you know, the CanStar data in line with the hotspots was actually responsible for that story. And it was actually in the paper in various parts of the country, including even in Tasmania, where I think there were big issues too. So now, if I then go on to talk a little bit about my models for those who may not know. Of course, we survey households. It's a rolling survey. It's continuing all the time. We take that information each month, put it into our core market model. We slice and dice the data all sorts of different ways. And we can also then look at things like where property prices might go based on different scenarios. And we can take the mortgage stress data, the price trajectory, the buying and selling intentions, the migration data, the economic data, take it in the core model, use the scenarios, and come up with, at a postcode, region, state, and all Australia level, and a view of where scenarios may run in terms of houses. And we'll touch on the scenarios later in the show. Now, before I go on, let me just remind you, for those who may not know, I do actually run a one-to-one service. This is where I can have a conversation with you individually about what's going on. And this is a confidential discussion, of course. It's not financial advice, but I can look at my data down at the postcode level. I can look at all the information about stress, home prices, and all the other trends, and form a view of where we may go. It takes an hour by Zoom or phone. There is a cost involved, simply because there's a lot of work involved to put the data together. You get about a 30-page report at the end of it. And if you're interested, you can contact me via the blog. Booking 3 to 5 weeks out. Got quite a few people who are chatting with me about their situation. But just as we go into definitions of stress now, before we look at the data in detail, now this is important because some people use 30% of income. Those earlier surveys did that. I don't think that's very helpful, but I use cash flow, money in, money out. And my argument is if households have more outgoings than income, we define them as stress. If they have a mortgage, then they're in mortgage stress. In renting, they're in rental stress. And investors, of course, are also measured in terms of cash flow terms. We can look at the data to estimate the total financial stress at a postcode level, and we can look both in percentage terms and counts. Percentages gives us one view, count another. I think on the law of big numbers, the count's quite important, but the latter, therefore, is what I tend to focus in on, but we might touch on some of the percentages later too. Now, just on stress and the spectrum of household financial stress, I want to come back to this chart. This is actually quite a good one because it's from the RBA, and they make the point that people can have mild budget pressures, but it grades into severe budget pressures, missing payments, and ultimately insolvency. The point to make is that insolvency is not a good measure of stress. The fact of the matter is that this earlier pressure is where it's all at. And so I measure it here in the very early stages of budget pressure, where people are having to prioritize, cut back. And if they don't have enough free cash flow to do all the things they want to do, and then we put them in the budget pressure area. And then as we go on, we see often over 2 or 3 years, people move into missing payments and then into perhaps insolvency if they haven't sold. Quite a few people sell in this period here. And the question, of course, the RBA is, where are you actually missing? Where are you measuring? Where are you measuring stress on your modeling? And I think, frankly, the RBA is probably measuring it a bit too late. So let's then look at the stress data for the August month. And the thing about this is that the stress data is obviously morphing over time. But we can look here and we can see that in August, firstly, rental stress is still very high, 76% of households. That's a very large number, as we'll see. So since the outbreak of COVID and everything else, the rental stress has gone through the roof. I think the reasons why is pretty clear, as we discussed earlier. Mortgage stress, 50% of households with a mortgage, an unoccupied mortgage here, are in difficulty, compared with 32% back before COVID. And by the way, the debt to income ratio is relatively high, but of course it misplaces the number because it spreads it across all households, not just those borrowing. So actually it's closer to 6. Now this is the data that we had based on the most significant information, the recent information. And quickly, just to show you that the charts here in percentage terms are in yellow, where it's higher than last month, and blue, where it's lower than last month. I'm just going to grab some water, hang on. The rental stress the same, and with investor stress and financial stress. But you can see here that overall 1.8 million households are in mortgage stress. That's out of the 9.7 million households. But it's about half of those borrowing. The rental stress is 2.38 million. So, investor stress, you can see there, 476,000 of those in the investments community. And overall financial stress is 47% of households. And that translates to about 4.6 million households. And that means that just under half of the 9.8 million households across Australia have some financial pressure. So that's the first stake in the ground. And it's really important to sort of understand, I'm measuring it early in that migration of stress, but it's widespread across the country, not equally spread, but it also means, of course, that more than half of households have no issues and they're managing their finances and they've got plenty of excess capital to invest. And in fact, interestingly, I've been doing some work for a client looking specifically at the investment side, and quite a few people have big money to invest. So we have a really diversified and I would say bifurcated community in Australia, with quite a few people under pressure and others not so. Now, if we then go on with the story, we can then look at the overall story by segment. And this, of course, is my cohorts. The reason I break it down is because it's important to understand not all households are equally caught. Young growing families, of course, often with mortgages, often first-time buyers, way up there. You can also see that some of those on the urban fringe and in the battling urban outskirts are also quite exposed to. Others less so. The wealthy seniors, not so much. The rural families, not so much. And even some of the more mature, stable families and the suburban families are actually doing it quite well. On the rental stress front, it's still the multicultural establishment, the first generation Australians who've come in, the migrants. 85% of them have difficulty, and that's one of the highest. You can see also too that more mature, stable families are struggling with rents as well, as are some stressed seniors. This rental stress story is huge, and I'm really quite, well, a little bit disgusted, frankly, that the Reserve Bank is not taking adequate account of the stress in the rental sector. They're arguing, of course, that mortgage stress is there because of the connection with financial stability. But for me, this broader question about how renters are coping is a really critical one, and it's not being adequately covered by the Reserve Bank. Maybe they don't think they've got as much responsibility, but I would argue that because it's inflation that's causing the problem, they do have a significant responsibility for that too. If we then look at the stressed investors, you can see there that the most significant number cohort is actually amongst exclusive professionals. Now, they have the biggest portfolio of investment properties, but it also means that some of those investment properties are not performing very well. Interestingly, young affluents are there too. And one of the interesting observations based on the recent tax changes was, in fact, those tax changes helped the exclusive professionals more than the young affluents, because it used to be the young affluents who had the biggest amounts of investor stress. But in fact, since the changes, the stress has come down for young affluents, but has gone up for some of the exclusive professionals. And then you can also look at the aggregate, the financial stress. That's all sorts of stress aggregated. And you can see there that 66%, 2/3 of young growing families, whether they're renting or have a mortgage, are in difficulty. So that's the story. And unfortunately, I don't see any end to what's going on at the moment. Now, we can spend a little bit of time just looking at the top line story with regard to where the postcode analysis is, but I really would like to get on to some of the mapping quite quickly and then go into the details, because I went through some of the earlier data on my show. So if you want to check that out, do so. But I will just put up this slide, which is actually the mortgage stress slide, which shows you that it's Liverpool, Campbelltown, Tapping in Western Australia, Toowoomba, Camden, and then Narre Rochester Park, Pakenham, Berwick. All, of course, high growth corridors in the outer suburban areas of Victoria, then Ballarat, and then more of the outer suburban areas, and then Riverstone, Cranbourne, and Pine Mountain. So that's the story with mortgage stress. And you can see there that there are quite a large numbers. This is based on the count of households in these areas. And I will make one point here that somebody actually asked me the other day, well, surely these postcodes have larger numbers of households. So of course they're going to have more that are actually in difficulty. And that's partly true, but differentially, these postcodes have a higher proportion in difficulty as well. So it's a combination of big postcodes with big numbers and highly exposed households too. If we then quickly look at the rental sector, well, Melbourne sits there at the top, then Toowoomba, Liverpool, Westmead, Southport and Labrador in Queensland, Campbelltown, Coomera in Queensland, and so it goes down. Bundaberg, Ipswich in regional Queensland as well. If we then go to the stressed investors, you can see there that WA, as Tasmania and Cranbourne in Victoria, Westmead, New South Wales, Toowoomba, Lane Cove in New South Wales. I want to highlight some of these more affluent areas is where some of the mortgage stress for the investors is. And this is because the investors are unable necessarily to put their rents up sufficient to cover the increased costs, and they've often got quite large properties with big mortgages on them, so they're highly leveraged, which means that quite a few investors have difficulty. And then finally, just quickly, the financial stress. So this is the aggregate score. Toowoomba is the postcode at the moment with the highest level of financial stress, with about 58% of households, or 47,000 households, in difficulty. Then we have Liverpool, where 72% of households have an issue. We have Campbelltown with 79%, Cranbourne in Victoria at 52%, Hoppers Crossing with 49%, Point Cook with 45%, and Craigieburn with 53%, and the centre of Melbourne with 76%. Now, the point I want to make about this, even here, you can see not all households are equally being impacted. So there are some with difficulty, there are others with less difficulty. And what that suggests to me is that when we look at these numbers, we need to understand that not even all households in the particular postcard are necessarily actually being hit the same way. And that's a really important factor, I think, to think about. And just to sort of bring that to life a little bit, what we can do is we can look at the information on our mapping. And of course, our mapping here, let's put that slide up. This is actually looking into the centre of Sydney. And you can see here I'm mapping the count of households in mortgage stress. And as we drill out, you can see here that in and around the centre of town, there are some. So if we're getting them to the yellows, which means we're in the sort of 2,500 to 3,000. But as we pull out, you can see that the problem gets a little worse. And we start seeing Liverpool coming into vogue. And other western suburbs as well, up towards Blacktown, some of those areas as well. So you can see here we've got the ring of fire around the west, of course. There are pockets, of course, closer in. Now, if we were to go to Melbourne, we can do a somewhat similar story and show you the angle there. So this is the Melbourne story. And once again, oh, hang on, sorry. Try 3,000, Martin. Sorry about that. There we go, 3,000, yep. So this is the Melbourne story. This is the count of mortgage stress. And you can see there that the stress levels build as we move out. Not uniform, patchwork quilt as always. But as we go west, we can see Wyndham shows up. Big problems there in the mortgage stress market. And here we can see also in both the north and to the east, those areas I called out earlier, in this area around here, around Casey, and Ballarat there showing at the edge. So you can see that we've got to the north, to the west, and to the east. Not so much, but some in the centre of Melbourne. And I will highlight that some of these areas here, specifically 3029, 3064, as well as those, are actually in significant pressure at the moment. Now, if we were to look at Perth, maybe a bit of a different story, you'd say, because, of course, prices in Perth have been rising quite strongly. But nevertheless, the truth is that even in Perth, there are some little pain points. And some of those pain points, again, are these high growth corridors to the north and the south, with a lot of people finding it quite difficult. This postcode here, 6065, is one that really stands out. There are some other ones to the south and to the north. And as we pull out from Perth, we can see that on the coast, 6030. Stop making postcodes up, Martin. And down towards Rockingham, a few pressure points too. So again, even in those buoyant areas of Perth, mortgage stress still exists. And interestingly, the default rates in the west are actually higher at the moment than in many other parts of the country. And I might just do 4,000 to give you a comparison. Because in Brisbane, the mortgage stress story is also patchwork quilted again. In the centre of town, some stress. As you pull out, places like Camp Hill, or if you pull out further, you can see that other areas, like Mount Crosby, for example, Ipswich coming in there. And as we move out, even towards the Gold Coast, there are some pressure points too. So once again, it's worth just understanding that this is very much a question of different locations with different types of communities experiencing the different pressure points. And, I could go on and I could show you the financial stress maps and everything else, which I might do later in the show, depending on the questions. But I wanted to sort of move the conversation forward and just spend a little bit of time on the scenario side of our analysis. The reason that scenarios are important is because the scenarios tell us quite a lot, potentially, about what's going on and gives us some sensitivities to where things may play out. So if I look at the scenarios, you can see here that we're talking about ways of thinking about the future. This is not a forecast, and I always get frustrated when people quote this back to me as a forecast. It's not a forecast, it's a sensitivity. And the scenarios run forward from today, and there are three that we look at. The first one is the good old Goldilocks zone. So let's assume that the rates stay full later next year. Inflation eases in line with expectations from the RB. Wage rises continue. We don't get a recession and migration remains strong. So that's the sort of the best scenario. The next scenario is the softer landing one, where you've got rates staying at 4.35% through 24, and in fact stay there and rise a little later because inflation still is sticky, and the inflation stays above target until 26. No recession, but migration dials back. And that's either because of government policy or because people choose not to come to Australia because of the economic problems that are generated there. The third is the nightmare scenario, where you see rates in rising above 4.35%. They stay high through 2025, along with inflation that's still sticky, unemployment rises, wages growth stalls. We get a recession in Australia. Rates fall later because they try and react to it. Migration drops well below average, and we're cooked. So those are the three scenarios. And what that gives us is a view then of how this all plays out when we actually think about looking at it down at the granular level. And I can show you some scenarios for individual postcodes, which I will do in a second. I also have those at a high level. I'm not going to show you the high level ones today because those aggregate scenarios really are masking the significant variations down at the postcode level. And I keep saying, go granular, look at the information granularly, because that will tell you what's really going on. So I think with that introduction out of the way, what we can do is then get into individual postcodes. And I'll just use this one because I happen to have it at hand to walk you through the way that the modeling works. Some of you may not have seen this before. So this allows us to look at the households in this particular postcode. This is postcode 2500, which is including the central Wollongong. And it's one I know very well, of course. So there's 18,000 there with, you can see there, 27% own outright, 23% borrow, 49% are renting. It's a lot of rents. And you can see there we measure the stress levels for mortgages, 28%, rental stress at 82%, stressed investors and overall financial stress. We can look at the mix of property. So how much is houses, how much is units or other types of property that could be living over retail or other types of property. We then have a breakdown in terms of the people ratio, which is, if it's higher, then that's families. If it's lower, it's individuals or couples. We then have the gross and net investment yields. Gross investment yield is the relationship between the price of the property and the average rent that's commanded for that property. The net investment yield is a cash flow measure based on what it takes for a typical investor to own and manage the property, let it out, and also comparing that with the rental income that's coming in. Quite often, of course, the net investment yield is negative, as you perhaps might expect. Now, if you look here, we've also got the taxable income. This is from the ATO and also from the household census. That gives us a disposable monthly income. So that's the after-tax available income. And you can then see that 43% in this postcode is going on the typical mortgage at more than $2,467 each month and every month. Whereas for typical rent, it's 35%. And that's $1,993. And let me just make the point that the idea of 30% being a critical threshold, which is what a lot of people are using for this, is probably old hat now. If you go back 2 or 3 decades, 30% was quite a reliable indicator because banks would lend 3 times typical income for a mortgage. Now, of course, they're lending typically 6 times. And what I want to highlight as we go through this analysis is this ratio. Because if you're above 30, 40, 50, 60, as we'll see in some areas, that tells you that households have real pressures. So with that context, I think what we can now do is to look at some of the questions that people add. And we'll just start with this first one from, let's put that back up there. There you go. Love your work, mate. Can we look at Bunbury 6230? This actually was one in the chat for one of the earlier shows. And the answer is yes, I can do 6230. Okay, let's put that one up. Just going to switch that across so you can see it. Right. What I've done is I've just made this larger. I had some feedback from last time that people couldn't always see the numbers. So I've sliced off the chart, but you've still got all the data. So you can see here in Bunbury, 18,000 households are actually there. 28% own outright, 38% are borrowing, 33% are third are renting. You've got 62% of borrowers in mortgage stress, 88% in rental stress. You've got overall financial stress at 57%. You've got 80% of houses, small number of units and other types of property there too. The people ratio is above 2, so that's going to be couples, maybe some families too. The vacancy rate, this was back when the census was done, and that, of course, was when COVID was in full force, so that may be overstating, but it could also be to do with second homes and those sorts of things, 10%. Gross investment yield is 3.8, net investment yield is minus 0.9. The average taxable from the ATO was 81,000, from the household census 76,000, and that gives us a disposable monthly, on average, of just over $5,000. And you can see in this postcode, 35% of income on average is going on the mortgage, typical payment $1,820 a month, and 29% going on the typical rent. And you can also see there that the scenarios are also showing you that the best case scenario is still growth. There is still growth in Western Australian prices. However, on the base case, almost no growth, and in fact, over 3 years, potentially a bit of a fall, and the worst case, a more significant fall. And by the way, if in fact the worst case were to come, the falls would be quite significant. So that's the sensitivities that we've got. Now, while I'm on the sort of the pre-asked ones, I had a few that were in the chat earlier on in the show. So 6065 was one that I was asked for, which is that one there. And 6065, which includes Hocking and various other places. You're tapping, you can see it all there, Wanneroo. Remember that 6065 was on my list of troublesome postcodes. So here, 24,000 with 22% earning outright, 59% borrowing, massive amounts of mortgage leverage there, a lot of new development, a lot of new properties being chucked up, 70% renting, 77% in mortgage stress, more than 11,000, 66% in rental stress, some stressed investors, and 58% in financial stress overall. 94% of houses, of course, they're squeezed together, and a small number of other types of property. The people ratio is higher. This is mostly families. The vacancy rate of 4.6% was a little lower than the previous one. Gross investment yield 3.8, net investment yield minus 0.4%. So most investors underwater. And this is the interesting point. Average taxable 78,000, household income on average 110. Where there's a big divergence there, it suggests that multiple incomes are going to pay the mortgage. Typical monthly disposable income $6,800, with 35% going on the typical mortgage and 29% going on the typical rent. And taking all of the information and the stress and flowing it into the scenarios, well, there is still a scenario, if things go well, that prices could continue to rise. But the base case, this is my most likely case, is that prices will flatten and maybe fall over the next 3 years. In the worst case, they would fall quite substantially. And of course, if you look at the iron ore price and so what's happening with some of the issues there, you might argue that the base case is relatively more likely now. So that's that one. I had also a request for 4510 before the show started formally. And that's with Beachmere and places like that, Caboolture. And here, 4510 has 20,000 households with 26% earning outright, 35% borrowing, 38% renting. We have mortgage stress only at 19% for the owner-occupiers, but 85% for the renters. We quite often see this divergence, a lot of renters in difficulty, mortgages holders in some places less troublesome. 44% is the financial stress, and 83% are houses, some units and other types of property. People ratio is high again, so we're still seeing families. Vacancy rate was higher at 6.9%, so there might be some second homes or Airbnb there as well. Gross investment yield is 4.7. Basically, Queensland has a stronger gross investment yield, and net investment yield is just marginally positive at 0.2. And you can also see here the average taxable is 62,000 versus 68. So it's pretty much in the same ballpark. And you can see here that overall 4,400 is the monthly disposable monthly income. And we've also got 43% showing the typical mortgage repayment, 1,900, and 36% going on the typical rent. So those are both somewhat higher, and that explains some of the pressures. But I would make the point that you can actually be paying 43% and still not be in stress. You still have capacity to manage your other finances okay. Looking at the scenarios, best case, still a growth rate up to 16% over 3 years, but the base case is a fall, minor fall. The worst case, a more significant fall there. And the other one that I was asked for before we went on air was 4118. And that gives us, this is like Heritage Park, Regent's Park, Hillcrest, Browns Plain. Again, in Queensland, 10,000 households, 22% owning outright, 47% borrowing, so another high growth corridor. A third of borrowing, 32% in mortgage stress, 88% in rental stress. Some pressure as well in terms of households. Overall financial pressure, 45%. 90% in houses, other types of property there. We're also looking at the people ratio, again, very high, so mostly families. 4.2% is the gross investment yield, minus 0.2% is the net investment yield on average. Average from the ATO income, 66. Household sensitive, 90. So you can see multiple incomes going on those mortgages. Gives a disposable monthly, I should say, of more than 5,700, with 34% going on the typical mortgage and 31% going on the typical rent, so both above that 30% mark. Scenarios are still, well, if you're lucky, you might see further growth in prices, but the base case and the worst case is a fall over the next little while. So there we go. That, I think, is caught up. Now let me go back to the chat and have a little bit of a look as to what's been going on. I'm sure that there's a lot of significant points to make. Cookie made the point. Let's put that one up. Those average loan numbers are horrendous. Absolutely. It is, of course, very, very significant set of issues. But like I said, it's part of the story. It's not the full story. The tax take and all of those things absolutely crushing many people. So let me just see what else we've got in the chat here. Oh, we've frozen. Oh dear. Sometimes the chat freezes when in fact we have so many chats going on. We've got a lot going on there in the chat at the moment. So keep those chats coming. I'll try and catch up. Let me just see what else I can find here. Whoa, missed. Come on. That's it. Okay. Here's one. Sunnybank, 4109, please. Let's try putting that one in. Okay, let me cut back to that. And I'm going to take the chat off just so we can see all the data. I try to make the slide a bit smaller, but then you can't see the number. So, okay, so this is Sunnybank. So we have 12,000 households here, 36% own outright, 27% are borrowing, and 35% are renting. You've got a third or 30% in mortgage stress. You've got 80% in rental stress, and you've also got some stressed investors too. So financial stress overall is about 42%. You can see here that 83% are houses, small numbers, other types of property. People ratio is above 2. So we've got families as well as individuals. Vacancy rate was 7.2%. So it's possible that there is some Airbnb and second homes there. Gross investment yield is 4.7. Net investment yield is 0.8. You can see here taxable income was 69,000. Household census said 87,000. So again, multiple incomes. Gives a disposable monthly on average in the postcode of $5,600. 40% going on the typical mortgage at $2,288 a month, each. 36% going on the typical rent at more than $2,000 a month. And you can see the pressure there is quite significant. Looking at the stress translates into what may happen to prices. Best case scenario, still growth, maybe up to 17% over the next 3 years, but the base case is a bit of a fall, and the worst case is a more significant fall. And we're seeing that quite often across the various locales. So that's the 4019. Hope that was helpful. Here's one. 2200. Let's put that one up now. Okay, so this is in the Bankstone area and includes Bankstone and Condell Park. It's going to take your post off so we can see. So here we have 15,000 households on average. 25% are owning outright. 28% are borrowing. 46% are renting, so a lot of renters in the area. 23% in mortgage stress. 86% in rental stress. Some stressed investors, but overall financial stress at 55% is somewhat higher than we saw in some of the other areas. We've got 38% of houses, lots of units, 44% other types of property there too. PPP ratio is high, so again, families. Vacancy rate was 8.8%, and we had 3.4% of gross investment yield and minus 0.7% net investment yield. So many investors are losing money on a cash flow basis. So they're going to be hoping for capital appreciation, which we'll open in a second. Taxable income from the ATO, 63,000, 72,000 from the census. So there's a bit of a disparity there. So maybe multiple incomes giving $4,700 on average, 50% going on the typical mortgage. That's high. And 43% going on the typical rent. So $2,368 versus $2,000 for the rent. Looking at the scenarios, best case, 11% over 3 years, base case down 8% over 3 years, and a worst case down 28% over 3 years. Units following on quite closely. So that's that one. And it's interesting, quite a few of these outer suburban areas are actually seeing some issues there. So that's that one. Hope that was helpful. Let's see whether there are some other questions that are coming in. Yes. We had 2200 asked quite a few times. Sorry about the delay. I just couldn't get to it until I could actually do the rest of it. Okay. Drew says this is quite funny. I'm like John Campbell, who had to take a video down about the truth, just like the government in camera meetings. Well, I don't know. I am talking about this stuff because I really think it's important. I really think that this is a very significant factor that people aren't really understanding. And the more that you look at it, the more you realize that the truth is out there if you want to see it. But of course, a lot of people prefer not to see it. Okay, here's another one. 2486. So this has this is Tweed's Head and areas around that on the north coast. 13,500 there, 44% owning outright, 34% borrowing, 21% renting. Mortgage stress only 25%. Rental stress is higher at 75%. And you can see here 66%, 2/3 of houses. There's also units and other types of property there. PPP ratio is a little low, but above 2, so some families and some more established communities, I suspect there. The vacancy rate at 5.8% was relatively low, but could include some second homes and Airbnb. 3.5% gross investment yield, net investment yield minus 0.4%. So one of the things you may notice is that there's been quite an uptick of people selling in this area. That's one of the reasons. Average taxable, 67,000 versus 66,000. So that gives us disposable monthly of 4,100, with 55% going on the typical mortgage, more than $2,200, and 50% going on the typical rent, more than $2,000. Now, of course, it's worth saying that if there is second homes here, they wouldn't necessarily be counted in the census and therefore my analysis, but if these are people living in the area. Looking at the scenarios, the best case scenario is still 14% up over 3 years, but the best case is a fall of 5, worst case a fall of 25 over the next 3 years, units following suit. Ben makes the point. Mortgage is better than renting. That's an interesting debating point, of course. The answer is that if you actually do pay a mortgage and eventually pay it off, you end up owning something. if you're paying rent, it gives you somewhere to live, but may not actually give you anything. I guess the other point is that if you need flexibility, sometimes renting is good, but generally I tend to think that trying to own your own property makes sense. But of course, if you're buying in at a stupid level and then you see a capital drop, then that's something else to bear in mind. Sometimes when the markets are uncertain, holding onto a rental property for a period of time can be strategically more a sensible move. So it depends, I think. Okay, interesting debate here. Blanket statement in this case holds true, considering 6% of all properties have a mortgage against them. Well, actually, it is interesting. So there's a third, roughly across Australia. 1/3 of people own outright, roughly 1 people rent, and 1 people have a property with a mortgage on it. That's roughly the top level split. It does vary. So roughly 2/3 of people are actually in the owner-occupied on the occupied gain, although those owning outright is dropping over time. Those owning with a mortgage is rising, and those in the rental sector are rising. So the sector that's losing out here are those that have paid off their mortgage. So that's the sort of the bottom line data point. All right, let's see what else we can find in the, whoops. Thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciate that. 2110. Give that a go. See, super chats work. This is Hunters Hill. Let's put the slide up. Okay, so in Hunters Hill, just over 3,300. So look at that low density. Must be room for some more houses there. 43% own outright, 34% are borrowing, 21% are renting, just 10% in mortgage stress, 75% in rental stress, some stressed investors, and we have financial stress at 39% overall. 70% are houses, some are units and other types of property. And we've got relatively high vacancy rates, so there's maybe some second homes and Airbnbs in the area as well. 3.7% gross investment yield, just under the water level for net investment yields. Look at these taxable incomes, 229,000 on average, 175,000 from the census, gives a disposable monthly of more than 8,200, with 63% going on the typical mortgage and 32% going on the typical rent. Now, I make the point, these are big, big mortgages, more than $5,000, because the properties, of course, were very valuable in this area. The rents are very high. But even then, the overall levels of mortgage stress are quite low. But that's because, of course, more affluent households have more capacity to still pay the bills. And it is true that we are getting more and more people at the lower end of the income scale falling off the plank, as it were, whereas those further up definitely more insulated from what's going on. Although over time, as I've said before, over time, what happens is that some of those more affluent households, if they've got investment properties, they've got ways out. They can sell the property, but sometimes their cash flow is under pressure. And so I do see pressure among some households in the more affluent groups as well. Okay, here's one. Mr. Poke Dragon 2036. Okay, so let's put that one up, 2036. So this is Port Botany and the Phillips Bay and around that Matraville, that sort of area there. And you can see here that we've got 12,700 households with 26% owning outright, 29% borrowing and 43% renting. You can see here that mortgage stress is at 13%, rental stress is at 86%, stress investors is at 32%, and households in financial stress overall is 59%. We've got 35% houses, 46% units, and other types of property, 17%. People ratio is 2.34, so it's going to be quite a few people with families. Couples, vacancy rates 8.5%, possibly some properties there were vacant because of the COVID situation. 3.5% gross investment yield, net investment yield minus 0.5%, so underwater. Average taxable 91 versus 106 from the household census, so there's probably multiple incomes going on the mortgage. Average disposable, $5,900, giving a 56% measure at $3,300 on the typical mortgage, and 43%, $2,591 on the typical rent. So once again, it's expensive to live in some of the inner suburban areas, but because of the higher levels of income that you're seeing in some of those, there is still relatively low levels of stress compared with some other areas. Okay, Samuel asks for 4655, which is Craigish, Happy Valley, Torquay, Susan River, quite a significant area there actually. Okay, and in this postcode, 28,000 households, 44% owning outright, 28% are borrowing, 27% are renting, 16% are in mortgage stress, 79% are in rental stress, overall financial stress 31%. Looking at the property profile, 85% are for houses, 2.7% units, some other types of properties there, so mostly houses there. People ratio is a bit lower. 4.7% gross investment yield, net investment yield positive 0.7%. And looking at the taxable income, 68,000 versus 57,000, giving a disposal monthly of 3,600. 47%, 1,727 going on the typical mortgage, and 46, 1,694 going on the typical rent. Scenarios, 18.9% positive in the best case scenario, flat for the base, and 20% down for the worst case scenario, that particular postcode. So more information there, which is quite interesting. And I have to say, I've been watching some of these Queensland postcodes with quite a lot of interest. Thanks for the super chat little adventure. Appreciate it. Okay. 2012. Did I do that one? I may have done that one. I'm not sure. I forget, and I don't have something in my program that tells me I've already done it. This is Paddington. This is another one. Let's put that one up. These inner city ones or any inner suburban ones are quite interesting, actually. Just 6,900 in this postcode, 25% owning outright, 26% borrowing, 47% are renting, 28% in mortgage stress, 90% in rental stress, some stressed investors, and overall 65% in financial stress. The scenarios are best case, maybe 5% higher, base case down 13, and worst case 33% down. So not so much growth there. Looking at the mix of properties, houses 7.1%, units 39%, other types of property 53%, so quite mixed there. People ratio is lower, so that'll be including some individuals and some couples. Significant vacancy rate of 14.4% at the time of the census, 3.7% gross investment yield, net investment yield 0.2%. Disposal monthly, based on the 175,000 from the ATO, 146,000 from the census, gives more than $9,000 a month, with half, 50.9 actually, 4,620 going on the typical mortgage, and 32.6% going on the typical rent, 2,965. Quite bright, asks for 3840. Well, I hope somebody might do a Melbourne one, because Melbourne is not looking flash at the moment. So this is in the Morwell district. Just 7,000 households there, with 39% owning outright, 29% borrowing, and 31% renting. 96% in mortgage stress. Ooh, that's high. 72% in rental stress. Stressed investors are there too, 56% overall. 87% are doing 87% houses, 6.3% units, and 5.8% other types. We've got people ratio of 2. We've got vacancy rates of 9.5%. We've got 3% on the gross investment yield, minus 1% on the net investment yield, 68 versus 53,000 on the census versus the ATO, giving a disposal monthly of 3,600, with a 35.3% actually going on the mortgage, 1,300, 29%, 1,072, And the scenarios are even the best case scenario. More falls, I'm afraid, in the base, significant falls in the worst case, shocking falls. So Melbourne is not looking very strong. Ronald, thank you very much. Super chat there. Thank you for that. And you asked for 383981, which we can happily do. 3981. That's a local currency you're quoting in there, I see as well. Thank you. Okay, now 3981. I should just start by saying that this is a low count. What I mean by that is that statistically speaking, I have a 0.5% sample. On low postcodes, they are less reliable. So it's a little bit difficult. But nevertheless, you can see there 29% are outright, 53% are borrowing, 70% are renting. There's no mortgage stress, as I can see. There is some rental stress, quite a lot actually. And we've got the overall financial stress of 29%. We've got mostly houses, 92%, small number of other types of property there too. We've got a people ratio of 2.57 and the vacancy rate of 6.5. We've got 3.6% gross investment yield minus 1.7% net investment yield, so not making much in terms of returns. This is, by the way, in South Gippsland. 67,000 versus 91,000 are the taxables. And that gives a disposal monthly around 5,300. 41% going on a typical mortgage, 2,200 versus 29%. 1,559 going on typical rent. And scenarios are, well, you know, almost no movement if you're lucky. But unfortunately, there could be falls over the next little while on the base and worst case scenarios. Interestingly, Otto asked this question. I've noticed much higher incidence of rental stress compared to mortgage stress, even with the same postcode. What's your explanation of this? Yeah, it is so. And it's because quite often those people who are owning property have a better financial foundation to be able to go by. What it means is that they've got more capacity to spend. And of course, quite often they get a mortgage, and renters tend to be at the sort of the peak of their ability to pay and have much more limited cash flows generally. And what that means is that their gross income is lower, their net disposable is lower. And if they want to live in that area, whilst the rent might be a little lower than the payments, they've actually having to put a higher proportion, and that puts more people under pressure. So it's because most people in the rental sector, generally, not always, but generally, are actually less well financially positioned to start with. I think that's the reason why we have it. You're very welcome. Glad to help. Ronald said, I have no idea how to change it. No, it's fine. It's funny. It's quite interesting seeing the different exchange rates and things, but people shouldn't assume that that was Aussie dollars, right? It was another currency. Okay. And Joe also makes the point. Rents have gone up more. That's true. Mortgages have gone up, of course, because the interest rates have risen. So for a lot of people, their mortgage rates have risen, but actually the rentals have been up. So that's another factor. Basically, you're a prisoner. If you are in the rental sector, you're a prisoner because you either have to decide to pay up or move on. And if you move on, you've got to find somewhere else to rent. And or what you do is you actually decide to go and buy, and then you buy something in the outer suburban areas, a cheaper property in a poor area, maybe a property lemon. I'm seeing a lot of that at the moment. Unfortunately, people often do it without doing the due diligence that they should do. And what that means is that they don't necessarily have the protection that they need. And that essentially puts a lot of pressure on those households then in terms of what may happen. The rental sector is very much an issue. And I do think that there should be more focus on the rental sector, specifically for these reasons. You know, 1/3 of property is actually rented. 1/3 of households are actually in property that's rented, and they are under huge pressure. The government, and I have to say the RBA, don't want to talk about it. AI, thank you very much. Really appreciate the super chat in honor of Smooth. Smooth, there you go. Thank you very much. Let's have another look. This one here we go. Thank you very much for the super chat. 3156. Ferntree Gully. Interesting area, Ferntree Gully. Could tell you some stories about that, but I won't. Let's just knock that off so we can, whoops, get rid of that. The chat's very excited at the moment. Okay, Ferntree Gully, 14,600 there, 34% earning outright, 47% are borrowing, a lot of new development, of course, and recent construction there, 18% are renting. Not much mortgage stress, but quite a significant amount of rental stress in the area. It says 100%, it's plus or minus a few because it's grossed up, but it's still quite significant. 90% of houses, small number of other types of property. 2.55, so families as well as individuals and couples. Vacancy rate, 4.2%. Gross investment yields, 3.2. Net investment yield, minus 0.7%. Looking at the taxable, 77,000 individual, 101 household, so you can see here that multiple incomes often are going to pay that mortgage. Disposable monthly 6,443 based on the data I've got, with 37% going on the mortgage at $2,400 or 30% 1,944 going on the typical rent. Looking at the scenarios, best case would be a 5% rise over 3 years, base case down 14, worst case down 34%, units following suit. Shell asks for 4211. So this is Beachmont, Highland Park, Nerang, Pacific Pines in particular. It's one I've been watching quite closely. Let's just knock that off so we can see. Okay. Here we have 23,000 households with 25% owning outright, 46% borrowing, 27% of renting, 8.7% in mortgage stress, 91% in rental stress, some financial stress as well, 32%. 69% are owned as houses, 7.2% are units and other types of property there, 23%. 2.56, so again, families. 4.7% the vacancy rate, 4.5% gross investment yield. Net investment yield is positive, 0.4%. Taxable income, 69,500 versus 89,800, according to the census and the ATO, giving a disposable monthly of $5,500, with 41% going on the mortgage, 2,288, and 38.4%, 2,142, going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, best case, still a rise, base case, flat, worst case, a fall. And quite interesting. I think the Queensland story is really interesting and it's morphing quite quickly. Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. Thanks for bringing the stream to the masses. Thanks all for the chat. As Smooth suggests, I might lose my crown. If you like the stream, perhaps consider hitting the like button. Costs nothing and helps Martin. Indeed, thank you all. Please do like. Thanks very much, Jason, for the super chat. Always appreciate it. Really helps to cover the costs of what we do here. And my little adventure, thank you very much for the super chat again. Appreciate that. And then I think you went for 2063. So we'll give that one a go. Okay, so this is North Bridge. Let's put that back on screen so we can see it and get rid of that. Okay, so this is North Bridge around Lane Cove, that area, just over 2,200, low density, I noticed. 27% owning outright, 46% borrowing, 36% renting. Not much mortgage stress, but 83% in rental stress, some stressed investors and some financial stress as a result of that. 74% houses, 90% are units and other types of property. 2.67% 2.67, the people ratio. So again, families. Vacancy rate 6%, 3.6% gross investment yield, net investment yield minus 0.3%. Average taxable, 224,000 versus 201,000, so pretty high. Gives us a disposal monthly of around 11,500, which translates to a 48% or $5,579 per month for the typical mortgage and 31.9% at $3,688 for the typical rent in this particular postcode. Otto makes a very interesting point there. The world system works to get renters who can afford to jump out of the pan and go into the fire. Absolutely right. I am very worried by the number of renters who are so concerned about the rental situation that they're in. They're getting squeezed. They're thinking about future rate rises for those rents. And so they're looking at trying to buy something, but they're jumping from frying pan to fire simply because what they're doing is buying really quite poor quality properties, particularly units actually in some areas, often out in Western Sydney, leveraging themselves up. And of course, the other factor, if you're buying units, which is one I think I wanted to highlight today, is the amount of pressure there because of the additional fees that are coming through. So you have the strata levies and all those sorts of things. But as Four Corners showed on Monday evening, the fact is there are a lot of people who are being taken to the cleaners because of the, frankly, bad structural mechanisms that are used between the strata manager and the people who come to do the repairs and all those things. It was a very horrendous program. I do recommend you go see it if you didn't see the Four Corners, because basically it shows you that people in strata complexes are basically not in control of their finances, and they can be charged significant additional costs and fees. And quite often in my one-to-ones, I see people who've jumped from the rental sector into a unit and then are getting hit with massive fees they didn't expect. And that's a very important point. Do your homework is what I'd say. Okay. What else have we got? Okay. Question here from Hongstander 2285 for Runcorn 4113. Put the slide back up. So this is in Brisbane and Moreton, 10,500 households, 29% earning outright, 33% borrowing, 36% renting, with a third in mortgage stress, 84% in rental stress, and households in financial stress, 46%. 2/3 houses, as well as units, are types of property. 2.71 is the people ratio, so some families as well as individuals. Vacancy rates 5.1%, 4.6% gross investment yield, net investment yield of 0.5%. Average taxable 69,000 versus 94,800 in the household census. And that gives a disposal monthly of 6,000 with 34%, $2,076 a month on the mortgage and 34%, $2,044 on the typical rent. So there's that one. And Jason, you make a very important point there. Strata is often just a money train for those who get assigned by strata managers. Could they perhaps get kickbacks? Well, that's what Four Corners alleged. And I think you're probably right. You probably put more on that on it, because the fact of the matter is that it's all connected. So they actually had a chart in that particular show. They showed the connection between the builder, the strata manager, the people coming to do the repairs, and a few other holding companies and everything else. It is pretty concerning what's going on there. And again, it's not well regulated, and I'm not even clear who really is responsible for it all. So a lot of people are being taken to the cleaners. Australia, Truly Asia said, how about 2155? I see many purchased in 21, 22 are selling. Yeah, the short selling is actually quite interesting. Short duration hold. It's a real thing. So this is now in the Blacktown area, of course, and includes Kellyville Ridge and Rouse Hill. Let's put the slide up so you can see it. It's certainly a little bit of a story to tell here, I think. So you can see here, 23,800 there with 56% borrowing, 18% owning outright. 25% renting. A lot of people with mortgages, a lot of new development, of course, relatively new and selling now, as you say. 28% in mortgage stress, 76% in rental stress, some stressed investors, 42.5% in financial stress. And looking at the mix of property, 82% houses, though on small lots, of course, 10.9% units and some other types of property. 3.14 is the people ratio, so you've got bigger families there. You've got a vacancy rate of 4.4%. Gross investment yield is 3.5. Net investment yield is minus 0.4%. Average taxable, 94. Household income, on average, in the census, 158,000. So you can see those multiple incomes going on the mortgage, which gives a disposable monthly around $8,800, with 40% going on the typical mortgage at just over $3,600 and 33.9%, $2,990 going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, in the best case, still growth, but the base case and the worst case are falls. And indeed, in some areas there, I have seen prices on the way down. So watch this space. I do think that is one of those postcodes, and there are a few other ones that are actually worth watching, where people are changing their tune and beginning to move back and sell. I think we're going to see more forced sales. It's one of the things that I've been watching quite closely, and in fact, quite a few people, for example, down in the down the coastal strip, down towards Wollongong, I've seen quite a few people who bought 2 or 3 years ago now selling there, and prices are continuing to ease back there too as well. Now, Trevor asked for Mawson Lakes, 5095, and happy to do an Adelaide postcode. Take that off. Okay, so this is the Mawson Lakes area, and you can see 8,400 there, with 21% owning outright, 41% borrowing, and 36% renting. You can see that stress is at 52% and 57% for rental stress. You can see that the overall financial stress is 47%, 73% of houses, some units and types of property there. We've also got a people ratio of 2.45, vacancy rates 5.9%, gross investment yields 4.2, net investment yield underwater minus 0.2%. Average taxable 70 versus 86, so probably multiple incomes go on the mortgage. Average monthly disposable 5,499, with a third, 33.1% going on typical mortgage, 1820, and 31%, 1745 going on the typical rent. In terms of scenarios, the best case scenario is still further rises. Of course, Adelaide's moved up quite strongly in recent times, but the base case is not so positive, maybe flat and a fall in the worst case scenario ahead. See what else we've got. Running out of time, I think, so we'll have to move on. But before we do, 4879. This is Palm Cove, up in the Cairns area, or north of Cairns. Spent some nice holidays there in the cooler time of the year. And here we've got 8,800. With 29% owning outright, 39% borrowing, 30% renting, 41% mortgage stress, 54% in rental stress, and overall financial stress 35%, 78% of houses, 12% of units, and some other types of property there too, 2.1% ratio, so some families, but maybe some couples as well, 13.2% vacancy, and of course that includes Airbnb and holiday homes, those sorts of things will be there. Gross investment yield is 4.5, net investment yield is positive 0.4%. Average taxable 76,000 versus 88,000 in the census, giving a disposable monthly around 5,500, with 37%, $2,080 a month going on the rental of the mortgage, and 36,193 going on the typical rent. Looking at the scenarios, the best case still further growth, base case flat, slightly rising maybe. Worst case, significant fall. So it does depend on where we end up. Hope that helps. Okay. So Joe is saying, would love to know why 4305 and 4306 have been smashed so hard, seeing your map colour over in Brisbane. Yeah. Well, of course, remember that the map is showing there the total count of household. The critical thing about Brisbane is that the population ratio is much lower, so the density is lower. And that means that the counts on a national scale are quite a lot lower. When I'm looking at an individual postcode, I'm looking at the proportion in that particular postcode rather than the absolute count. So the earlier map was count. This was actually looking at it differently, right? Because if you look at the count, then you get one answer. If you look at the percentage, you look at a different answer. So that's why it's a different lens. And, you know, you could argue either way. And I may do another show sometime when I show more on the percentages, because the percentage story actually tells you quite a different story to the count story. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at it in terms of the big numbers, then I'm interested in where those big numbers are, because those big numbers, if they start changing their tune and selling, they could tip the markets over quite significantly. Whereas in small postcodes, if you could sell, it won't impact very much. That's why I look at the big numbers. Ben asks for Gordon, 2072. Let's do that one. I hope one of the things you see as we look at these different ones is how different individual postcodes are. You know, it's very important to go granular, and this is a way of illustrating that once again. Okay, Gordon in New South Wales, just over 3,300, so a small count, 32% own outright, 32% borrowing, 35% renting, 15.4% in mortgage stress, 85% in rental stress, some stressed investors as well. It's quite higher than what we've seen elsewhere, 69% in financial stress overall, 45% of houses, 48% of units and other types of property. Gordon, of course, is undergoing quite a significant change with a lot of high-rise development in the area. It's on the train line. 9.5% vacancy rate. People ratio is 2.4, so families as well as individuals. Gross investment yields 3.5. Net investment yields 0.1 positive. Average taxable 135,000 or 127,000 for the census, giving disposable monthly around 7,100, with 50% going on the typical mortgage, 3,640, and 40%, 2,875 going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, small rises, if you're lucky, base case a fall, worst case a significant fall ahead. Jason said, that's quite funny. Palm Cove, government will introduce new charges to bring that 0.4% yield down to negative. Either that or insurance flooding zones will. Yeah, good point. The investment yields up in Queensland, Perth and Adelaide have been quite a lot stronger than elsewhere. Sydney, of course, has seen it ease back, and Melbourne is way in negative territory. But it is interesting that if you track the trends up in Queensland, those investment yields have been falling. So it's less powerful than it was. So whilst asked, are we in the technical recession yet? Well, technical is, 2 negative quarters of GDP growth. And no, we didn't. We got 0.2% in the last round. That, of course, is because we had massive government spending and stimulus and all those government handouts as well, which helped to depress inflation. I think in reality, Australia is in recession. You can see that if you look carefully at some of those spending trends, which are way down. And of course, the iron ore prices also go negative. So if we aren't, we probably will be quite soon. So unfortunately, I suspect that recession is coming, but the government will do all they can to keep that gross GDP number up, spend a lot more, throw more money at households to try and keep GDP positive, because they don't want to actually have it reported officially as a negative 2 quarters. But will there be a successful? Look at New Zealand. New Zealand had a recession, has a recession, but they have now started to cut interest rates, but interest rates were higher. RBA has, in Australia, decided to try and keep the interest rates a little lower, but in doing so, they've extended the recession for a lot longer, and they may not be successful in actually dealing with the recession story. So we'll see. Anyway, I've hit the 9:30 mark, and I'm pretty much out of, let's have a look. There's one there, 467 out of time. Let me just do this one, 4670. If I haven't done it, I may have done it, I can't remember. Why Babe Burnett? No, I don't think I have. Let's put that one up. So this is Bundaberg, places there around there. Bundaberg, it's one of my hotspots, of course. 34,000 households, big count. 39% owning outright, 30% borrowing, 30% renting. 202.5% in mortgage stress, 90% of those in rent, and some rental stress for investors as well. And you can see overall the financial stress is at 38%, 83% of houses, some units, some other types of property. Looking at the people ratios, 2.18, it's 8.4%, so probably some vacancies, and that could be second homes and Airbnb. 4.7% gross investment yield, positive 0.5, so another one. Another one there, Jason, where they could put a few more fees and taxes and things on. 70,000 versus 62,000 for the incomes, giving a disposable monthly around 3,900, with 39% going on the rent and 36% going on, the mortgage going, and 36% going on the rent at 1,420 compared with 1,560. Scenarios are positive in the best case scenario, flat or slightly falling in the base case, and a more significant fall in the worst case. Thank you, Drew. I appreciate your comment on that one. I hope that what I'm showing here is helpful and useful. I'm trying to help people get their head around what's going on. Okay, John, this is the last one I'm going to do today in terms of postcodes. 4520, you snuck in. And we're in Mount Sampson. And there, whoops, missed, sorry. Yeah, that's better. Okay, when the chat moves up, I can miss the chat. Okay, so this is in the Mount Sampson area, including Camp Mountain and Sanford and places like that. You can see it there. 4,600 households, 40% own outright, 52% of borrowing, 7.3% of renting, 42% in mortgage stress, 100% in rental stress, plus or minus. 97% houses, some units, other types of property. 2.87 is the people ratio, so it's going to be families. 4.5% vacant. 4.6% gross investment yield, 0.4% net investment yield. 107,000 is the taxable. 145,000 is the census income, and that suggests multiple incomes going on the mortgage, giving a disposable monthly of $8,100, with 36% going on the typical mortgage and 29% going on the typical rent. And there you are. That will have to do for the story today from the issues relating to postcodes. I could go on all night, but I'm going to run out of voice, and I'm probably going to run out of things to say. But let me just go back to the slides and just make a couple of closing remarks, if I may. The first point to make is that if you are in financial pressure, and there are a lot of people who are, it's very important that you reach for the right help. And I'm very concerned that sometimes people do actually go and pile in on looking on Google and then trying to get help that way. You end up often paying for the help. You don't need to. The National Debt Helpline, 1-800-007-007, is a government-backed area that can help. They actually have financial counsellors now, according to what the Reserve Bank said. These counsellors are very much busier now. A lot of people are reaching for help, but that is a really good source for help if you've got difficulty. And if you are needing to organise your thoughts, this other tool here is quite helpful. This is actually the AFCA Statement of Financial Position tool. It's actually available on their website if you go to the AFCA website. And you can actually put in a whole lot of information and get your thoughts in order in terms of what money's coming in, what you owe, what your living expenses are, what you own, those sorts of things. And it's a very useful tool to be able to focus your thoughts, because, of course, I find that quite often when I talk to people, they don't actually have a very strong sense of what their cash flow is like, what their money coming in is, never mind what they're spending it on. And quite often they're spending it on the things that make the most sense. So a tool that helps to focus the mind is quite important. And I do recommend that tool. There are others out there, of course, but it is very significant for people sometimes to be able to go through that process. And as I say, reach for help. If you've got a mortgage, the banks are obliged to help. There is a hardship scheme, but unfortunately the hardship scheme just often extends the inevitable for a year or so, as ASIC recently showed in their report. But the bottom line is there is help available. Order your thoughts, look at your cash flow, and then prioritize effectively. Look for those high interest charging things to get rid of those first if you can. Be careful of grabbing more loans or buy now, pay later, or even payday loans. I've seen some people use that because that doesn't necessarily help. But if the cash flow pressures are insidious and growing, then you probably have to do something more radical. And that's why we do see more people now beginning to move to sell their properties and move on, or indeed restructure their finances considerably, which can include refinancing, extending the length of the loan, which means paying more interest, but perhaps over a longer period of time. But be careful, the banks are pushing people to refinance, but sometimes they're actually not helping by doing that. Remember, the bank's interest is protecting their security, not necessarily protecting individuals. And that's my basic takeaway for tonight. I mean, the Reserve Bank is talking about those with a mortgage under difficulty, looking at it through the financial stability lens. I'm looking at it from a household lens, and I do think there are more households in difficulty. Unfortunately, I think it's going to play out in the months ahead with more stress and more difficulty ahead. So it's important for individuals to try and get their household finances into order, which means some discipline, which means some prioritization, and which means trying to do the right thing and not necessarily just piling in for that big mortgage to buy that property that you can't really afford, which there are people still doing that. And the banks, of course, as we saw in those statistics, are lending more than ever. Well, that's pretty much it. Just before I go, let me just say that if you want to get more information about what we do, go to the blog. That's information there. You can also support us via Patreon. And in fact, we have quite a few people who do that. Really appreciate those who do. And specifically, if you want to get information on the more than 2,000 households, 2,000 postcodes, you can actually subscribe $50 a month. Had a few people do that recently, and I send that out each month after this show. So it'll be going out in the next 48 hours. And that gives you that breakdown that you saw for the postcodes for every postcode that I model. And that gives you also a lot of other information as well. So that is available if you want to get hold of it, and just go across to Patreon and sign up. Anyway, that's it. I think I'm done for tonight. Thank you very much for watching the show and taking time out of your Tuesday. And thanks for all the comments. Thanks for all the super chats. Been really appreciative of that. I hope you found it interesting and informative. I hope you found it also informative in a way that helps you to plan if you need to plan. And I would simply say this: if you do have financial pressure and financial stress, don't put your head in the sand and just ignore it and hope it'll go away. All the experience that I've seen in recent times is that this financial pressure is going to be with us for quite a long period of time. It's going to be quite difficult for people to manage, but the decisions that you take can make a really big difference. And so don't put your head in the sand, address it and find a way through. And if you can, you will. And that's going to then be helpful for you and your families. Right. That's it. I'm out of time. Just to say that next week, Tony Locantro will be on, and you and I will have a game of Locantro bingo as he goes through some of his thoughts as to what's going on. So join us for that. The week after that, I've got Edwin coming on. Edwin Almeida coming on the Tuesday live. We're going to do a special on some of the structural issues that we found on properties recently and go into a deep dive on what those structures look like and what we can draw from it. So that should be fun. We'll show you some videos and go into that. And the week after that, Damien Klassen is back with talking specifically about the markets, about what's going on there. So that's the lineup in the weeks ahead. So look forward to those shows. Check out my recorded shows, of course. Every day of the week I'm making shows specifically on finance and property. So check those out. And thank you very much for your support, super chat, and for spending some time with us this evening. Just before I go, we should just check the dogs out. Oh, there they are. They haven't moved, haven't made any noise at all. So the next thing on my agenda will be walkies with the dogs. Thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. Take care. Keep well. Hope your finances are in good order. And I look forward to seeing you on the next show. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.